Great. All right, good evening. My name is Gregory McCarthy. I'm a commissioner of the Tax Revision Commission of Washington, D.C. I'm substituting tonight for our fearless leader, Mayor Tony Williams, who I think is going to join us online, but I'm going to fill in for him here as best I can. Welcome to everybody who's present here with us, and welcome to everybody who's watching us on WebEx. Indicative of our high technology and skills here, I have a reminder here. We need to hit record at the beginning so that we have a video record of the meeting. So I wanted to put that out there and just confirm once again that we hit record. So this meeting will be available on our website after tonight for any citizens and residents that weren't able to be here but want to watch it. Tonight's topic is tax provisions for equity and opportunity, and we're going to learn a lot about what governments do to aid lower income families with their tax burden, but also we're going to talk a little bit about pilots and other ways that non-tax institutions can contribute to the tax base. But before then, let's go around the table and have the government staff and commissioners introduce themselves for the record. Start on my right here.
Yeshim Zain with the DC Policy Council.
Becky Strauss, Federal City Council.
Erica Williams, DCFPI.
David Catania, Mike Hegeman, Tax Revision Commission.
Glenn Lee, Office of the Chief Financial Officer, District.
Do we have any commissioners online? Jim Hudson, I see you're joining us.
Yep.
Okay.
I'm on.
All right, Jim, don't be shy about jumping in. So if we don't
Okay.
see with your hand up anything, just call in and let us know what you think. All right.
Okay.
So I think we're going to hear a little bit from Becky Strauss, I believe, who's going to sub for our research director, Nick Johnson, who's unable to be here tonight, about schedule of meetings and the like coming up, or is that not going to happen tonight?
I don't have that in front of me.
Okay.
At the next meeting, I apologize. I don't have that.
Okay. Well, to the public who's interested, we will be posting online some information about our public input process, and we commend people to go to our website and look for that. And we'll also have an updated list of our speakers and topics for subsequent meetings, and invite the public to also participate, observe that as well. Correct?
Within 1 week, there will be a new website.
Okay.
User friendly.
Is there any other commission business, looking at Becky and Mike, that we need to do today to put on the record, or? No? Okay. I'll turn to our esteemed CFO to talk to us a bit about updates from his last presentation.
Sure, thank you. As you all recall, we discussed different administrative changes that we'd like to make to the code. Things basically to try to make tax compliance easier, taxpayers. There were several questions about the minimum tax, the corporate minimum tax. We took your feedback back to our organization, looked at it, and we concur it needs a more broad thought process that could lead to actually policy changes. And that's, we're not here for that. We're here just to implement things that make compliance easier. So we're going to take those two items, there's three of them, out of our proposed bill, but move forward with that. In addition, there was some data requests about the scope of who was impacted on some of the payment things. We'll have that to the commission staff here in a couple working days. So, and then based on how you react to that, we'll move. Thank you.
Okay. Any questions from our commissioners? No? Okay. So let's go right to our two distinguished guest speakers. We have Dr. Bradley Hardy and Adam Longley here tonight. So we'll ask each of you to speak for about 20 minutes. And I think we'll take questions, a combination at the end. We'll start with Dr. Hardy, who is Associate Professor at the McCourt School of Public Policy at Georgetown University and former Department Chair of Public Administration and Policy at AU. I've noticed you've been a fellow as well at a lot of different distinguished places, including the Brookings Institution, Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis, and I noticed the Office of Revenue Analysis at the DC OCFO. So I know you're very proud of that. So you're going to talk to us about child tax credits and other things, what the state of play is here in the city, what best practices are around the country, and what we might consider for taking what we do here in the city to the next level or something.
Okay, great. Yeah, that sounds good. And Mike, how are we gonna run this?
Yeah,
in
that's all
terms
right.
of,
If you just want to kind of give me a nod,
Sure.
do try that way.
Yeah, I mean, and where do you want us? You want us up
If
front?
you want to stay up front, that'd be
Sure,
better.
okay, yeah, I'll, do like a little hand wave. So, yeah, I mean, the focus of my talk is gonna be largely on earned income tax credits, although I'll talk a bit about the child tax credit and how I think that kind of fits in. So, you know, couple points here, and I think there's like a wide range of backgrounds that folks are bringing to thinking about this question, but the earned income tax credit can be thought of, first of all, as a federal program, a federal initiative through the tax code, but then really a whole host of states and our city state here, 29 that have their supplements to this federal credit. But we've got this really important supplement for workers who are in positions where the wages are relatively lower. The results have been pretty robust over several decades that you're lowering poverty. In work that I'm going to show you tonight, we have pretty credible and convincing evidence that the credit also reduces racial income inequality. And then finally, at the same time, I think there's pretty widespread consensus that the EITC does promote work and upward mobility, but it's important not to kind of gloss over the fact that there's some obvious preconditions to having a job in the first place that puts some bounds on the effectiveness of the program. So we can go on next slide. Yeah, so, you know, just by way of background, the federal earned income tax credit, it is means tested. So this is a program targeted at workers with relatively low incomes, though the credit can be received well above the poverty line, the standard poverty line, right? But this comes in the form of a lump sum payment at tax time for our households. And, you know, in general, we see that some of the largest anti-poverty effects are for households where the head is unmarried. And so much of the research based on the earned income tax credit has focused on women with dependent children as a result. We've seen a lot of the movement on poverty and things like this. But, you know, effectively, you can think about this as being a wage subsidy that's just operating through the tax code, okay, at the federal level. You know, there have been some tweaks to how to administer the federal EITC, including some efforts to try to make an advanced EITC payment on a sort of a monthly basis. We saw a similar spirit in the 2021 child tax credit, where we were trying to deliver this at the federal level throughout the year. Interestingly enough, many households actually like the lump sum feature of having a pretty big cash payout in the spring, but there's some clear reasons why we care about income volatility, smoothing out some of the shocks that families have throughout the year. But nevertheless, we don't really have an advanced payment system for EITC. So when you're thinking about this, it's just that big payment at tax time. Okay, so grab this map from the Urban Institute just to show that, you know, there's 29 states. The purposes of our presentation, I'm going to call DC a state. I'm not trying to break any news here, but you know, 29 states that have a supplement to this federal credit. And, you know, you can think about this as, you know, essentially the federal level, leaving the states out of it, you're basically receiving anywhere from 8 to 45 cents on every dollar earned, up to some maximum. And, you know, economists have spent decades trying to understand what kinds of incentives this induces. And essentially what we found is that this really does pull people into the labor force, into work. It makes work pay, makes it more costly not to work. And so the theory lines up with the empirical evidence here. And then, you know, you got these 29 states that range in their generosity in supplements to the earned income tax credit. And then DC is really the most generous of the city states, if you will. And it's been that way even prior to this jump up to having a 70% match of the federal credit. And so in other words, you know, if you were to add this up, you say, you know, some DC household could receive, you know, up to $7,000, and you take 70% of that, that would be their state or city credit added up together, right? And, even earlier in the 2000s, DC had really made great progress in ratcheting up the size of the supplemental credit. And, it started off somewhere in the order of like 10% of the federal credit, and then sort of a 25 and a 35 and a 40. And so I think the city's been really good about being aggressive in this sort of support for working families. Importantly, there were changes through the recent ARP, American Rescue Plan, that did expand the federal EITC, and then that impact kind of populates down the states. But a really important program, and you can see that there's some pretty clear regional gradients. You see less evidence of any supplemental EITCs throughout the Southeast, for example. That's one geographic pattern that becomes large. Yeah. So, yep. Okay. So the evidence base, the short version is just that you've had a bunch of studies across the social sciences that now confirm that, look, the EITC is a pretty nice incentive for employment. It's, there's good credible causal research showing that, these boosts to the earned income credit are very much linked to increases in employment, right? And so I'm just naming a few of the studies that are showing this sort of result, and it makes sense. You're making work pay more. You're creating these positive incentives to entering the workforce. And I think a really neat statistic is that when you take the federal EITC and then kind of combine it with the child tax credit, which was especially generous this past year, you got almost 10 million people lifted out of poverty. Many of those are dependent children. So that's a really important statistic. How is this money used? All sorts of backlog repairs, car repairs, home repairs, clothing for the kids, things like this. And you've had a lot of sociologists do great work thinking about how folks are using these sorts of payments. So just a really important feature of the household budget. Yeah. And here I just want to call your attention. It's a little bit small, but these are basically transfer anti-poverty programs. And these bars are showing you the degree and extent to which they're reducing the number of people in poverty from the U.S. Census Bureau. And I should just say, I'm happy to kind of share resources with folks offline, some of the underlying reports that I'm drawing upon. But the main point is that we all know Social Security is a big anti-poverty program, but the refundable tax credits come in second. This almost 10 million number, and the darker hue of the bar reflects children who are lifted out of poverty. And so again, here in the district, you've got poverty rates that are above the national average, around 17% right now. And so I think these sorts of programs are really important for trying to tackle this problem. Go next slide. Okay, so, what I want to talk with you about today is some new work on racial inequality and racial income inequality. And so, my co-authors and I were really interested in this question. It really is one of the most durable forms of inequality that we've seen in the US. And, we think that growing up in low income, based on our social science evidence, has all sorts of long-term negative consequences on adult health, on adult earnings, educational attainment, things like this. That parents are less able to invest in their kids. That is a statement on average. There's absolutely adults who grew up in adverse circumstances who are doing outstanding, right? And that's very much the American dream. But we see empirically that those resources do matter. And so we wanted to tackle this question. How does this really important program, the Earned Income Tax Credit, which by now is the largest cash transfer to families with low income, how does this affect income inequality? I make that statement and it might kind of sound like, hey, no big deal. Well, so the Earned Income Tax Credit has surpassed over the past several decades traditional cash welfare as the most important cash transfer for America's low-income families with low income. So, we want to kind of dive into this question. Next slide.
More than TANF? Sorry. Is that...
Yeah, more than 10. Yeah. And, it's important to note, it's easy for me to fall into talking about the TANF program. There's really 50 TANF programs. I think DC's TANF program is relatively strong in terms of trying to provide sort of wraparound economic assistance for families, even after they hit the federal 5-year time. But in general, and there's folks on the commission can speak to this, the TANF program is relatively hollowed out from its predecessor program with respect to cash assistance. So happy to talk more about that offline or in the Q&A. But yeah, so what do we find? The credit is lowering inequality by anywhere from 5 to 10% in any given year. We do find evidence that overall the earned income tax credit is lowering Black-white inequality, both at the middle of the distribution and at the 25th percentile of the income distribution. And we're looking from about, the 80s onward. So we're taking kind of a broad look at how this program has impacted inequality. And so, over that time period, the credit has expanded at the federal level. And we take that federal EITC and then combine it with the state EITCs. And then over the 2000s, what you're going to see are that more and more states are bringing these EITCs on, and then they're becoming more and more generous. So all that's happening in the background. Finally, we kind of try to think about what's the mechanism driving this. And we think a lot of this has to do with pulling people into work, right? So next slide, we'll take a look at that.
Well,
Yes.
when you say 10th or 25th percentile, what is that percentile referred to?
So we're talking about the percentiles of the income distribution. Basically, what we're able to do is take families, we're able to group them, right, up and down the income distribution. And, I'll talk a little bit more about this, but we then basically assign points in the distribution by race. So ultimately, what I'm going to show you are statistics for comparing families at the middle of the distribution who are Black relative to their white counterpart families.
Compared to curves.
Yes,
Oh,
exactly.
okay.
Exactly. So, I'm going to show you some overall inequality statistics, and then we'll do it by race, right? And we can dive into some of those details even. So, first off, we just want to kind of think about overall, if we're thinking about, families at the middle of the distribution, we don't have a formal middle class definition, but the middle relative to the 25th, we see pretty robust inequality reduction, right? We see this reduction also occurring for families who are at the 25th relative to families at the 10th. So families at the 10th percentile are probably in relatively deep poverty, right? And we see these jumps after major tax reforms that are occurring in the United States, both in 86 and 1993. So we can take a look at those trends. And again, in this instance, the post-EITC trend, taking account of federal and state EITC, is the red line. And as the credits become more generous, we just see this, sort of descriptively larger impact on inequality. Again, both reducing inequality for those folks at the 25th percentile relative to their counterpart families in the middle. And then it's also the case for families that are, all below the middle of the income distribution. We see this occurring, right? So, I think, in some respects, that's some of what you would expect. And I think even as we were looking at this, it lines up roughly consistently with the policy becoming more generous at the federal level. Only other thing I would note is that it is a program that is conditioned on work. So if you have folks for one or another reason out of work in the first place, then you'll have this sort of cyclical behavior that you could expect to see here as well. Next slide. Okay, so I want to jump into our results on racial inequality. And again, I'll just take a little bit of time to kind of walk through what we're doing. We're essentially creating two distributions, a Black income distribution and a white income distribution. And so what we're going to do is compare inequality by lining up, a Black family at, say, the 50th percentile to a white family at their 50th percentile, a Black family at their 25th relative to a white family at their 25th. They are different distributions. And so in this exercise, what we are finding is that, yes, racial inequality is reduced by 10 or even 15%, depending on the year. We do see lower levels of income inequality reduction at the middle. And throughout this process, it's pretty clear that, one, the 50th percentile for Black households is, frankly, lower than that for their white counterpart families. And so this kind of comes up in our full paper that I'm happy to circulate. But then this last point is instructive. EITC is a really strong program for promoting employment. We think we're going to show that it reduces inequality. But look, it's conditioned on work. There are pretty sizable racial gaps in employment. And at the 10th percentile, we see this showing up. We see that there's pretty sizable employment gaps. And we think this is a big driver of the fact that at the 10th percentile, comparing white and Black households, there is no racial inequality reduction, maybe even a slight exacerbation. But when you put it all together, if you pool all the families on balance, this does reduce Black-white inequality. Let's take a look at the pictures. So again, see what this looks like. In this instance, trend lines moving north are sort of qualitatively good for reducing inequality, right? And so the post-EITC inequality does in fact jump up comparing families at the 25th and 50th percentile. And then in this far left panel, you can essentially just see that those two trend lines are just hugging each other right on top of each other. So this is what we're talking about here over a, over a 40-year period. Next slide.
But is that working to employment effects or wage effects?
You've anticipated. Yeah, this is great. Yeah, so we didn't plan this. So what's driving this, right? We wanted to test out the role of these entries into work, right? As Yeshua refers to. And, for time's sake, I didn't actually, put up some of the regression results thinking about these employment effects, but we engaged what we refer to as sort of an event study analysis, where we focused on the 1993 tax reform and try to sort of causally get at whether or not employment is really the underlying factor leading to this inequality reduction. And so what we do find is pretty strong evidence that there's really strong responses with respect to entry into work. So you can think about work being whether or not you were working, and then you go to work, and then how much you work. And so this so-called extensive margin effect, pulling people into the workforce who weren't working at all, that's the big deal from the EITC. That's the big mechanism that's really made this such a powerful program. And so ultimately, we see pretty strong results for Black households and white households, but stronger results for Black households. So on the one hand, we see that much of the poverty reduction and inequality reduction is being driven by pulling these households into work. Nevertheless, there is sort of a governor on the effectiveness of a wage subsidy for the households that, for one reason or another, are not at work, right? And so I don't think this is so much an indictment on the EITC. It just means that, even as we weigh such an effective program, we have to have some other programs to work in concert with. Next slide. Now, again, some of these figures look great on my Mac, but I'm happy to share this stuff with you all and other folks who are interested. The main point I want to kind of draw your attention to is that Black households are reflected in the bold line, and white households are the dotted lines. And so moving from blue to red to Black, we have households at the middle, 25th and 10th percentiles of the income distribution. And so, immediately what you see is that, look, there's obviously racial inequality in employment, even once you condition on income, right? So interestingly, those gaps seem to widen. as you move further down the household income distribution. And, for example, you see this interesting overlap in the top panel between, say, Black households at their 25th percentile and white households at their 10th percentile, right? And so these employment rates for these, Black households at the 25th are actually for a while lower than that of white households at their relative 10th percentile. Eventually, there's some intersection and overtaking there, but this does sort of speak to some pretty clear differences in the employment situation that have endured across race and ethnicity, though here we're focused on racial differences. And so again, this is going to be in the background in terms of thinking about the effectiveness of a program like the EITC. Next slide. So ultimately, and again, happy to kind of share the full paper with folks. We do find strong evidence that the earned income tax credit does induce employment, does promote employment across race, but with stronger effects for Black households. In particular, pretty strong responses among Black households headed by Black, right? In fact, an effect within our regression analysis that's twice as large as that for white. And again, as I was saying in the last slide, keeping in mind all the while that baseline employment rates for these groups are actually, fairly uneven. But this is an important result. We're really following a research design from Diane Schanzenbach and Michael Strain, who were doing some research on the EITC. Next slide. Okay. So, I hope to convince you that in addition to all the positive effects of the EITC to children's educational attainment, lowering poverty, it also does lower racial inequality. I think that's of particular importance here in the District of Columbia. I think policymakers have been pretty laser focused on aspects of racial inequality. So the program does do this at the federal and state level when we pool all the folks in the nation using census data. It does stand to reason that DC leading in this way with a pretty aggressive supplement stands to only further improve upon these types of results. But, it's also important to note that for our residents and households who, for one reason or another, are out of work or face work barriers, this program isn't going to have the same impact, right? Next slide, please. So, ultimately, you can think of it as a program that's providing support for many households who might be kind of transitorily poor or near the poverty line. It's not like if you have $1 or $2, above the poverty line, you're doing well qualitatively, right? And again, just kind of making this point that work participation is the precondition for this, very generous credit. And we know that, many of our households face a range of current day structural barriers, historical barriers to work and economic opportunity. I think folks in this room have thought hard about ways to try to undo those barriers for sure. And so, my only point is, there's work being done already to improve upon this, more targeted policies for some of these households. Excellent. So, I'd probably close with just a few ideas. The analysis that I'm showing you, it really does assume 100% take-up of the tax credit. And that's the nature of the empirical exercise with the data that I have available. But, CFOs, tax policy analysts, folks at this table know that there's a whole host of reasons why we don't have 100% take-up or participation in programs like EITC or the child tax credit that was, I think, really effective in lowering poverty. So I think that that's just something to always continuously be laser focused on. And some of that has to do with the complexity of the code. How do you convince folks who don't know that they have any, actually, you're right about this, they don't actually have a tax burden. They know that they probably don't owe taxes. Convincing them to come in and file, right? We're doing a lot of that good work. There's a lot of great VITA sites, but that's something that can be improved upon. again, complexity with respect to whether you qualify based on your age, right? So there's different credits for younger workers. There's differences between federal and city level EITC restrictions based on your age. So really kind of cleaning that up and making sure folks kind of have a sense for what they can benefit from, making sure that's safe. And then frankly, I just kind of want to call out some of the good work I think that's occurring through programs like DC's TANF. Obviously, there's more work to be done, but I think relative to some of the other states, there is an opportunity for many families to package EITC with some really good supports when they face some serious economic hardship. So, I think programs like the child tax credit at the federal level have been found to be extraordinarily effective in, lowering poverty. I do think that the non-work conditioned nature of the child tax credit will have some really helpful features for households that face hardship. So, I probably just close by saying that the district's credit, earned income credit, I think has been a success in lowering poverty and inequality. And, I'm excited to see what the more aggressive versions of this so, thanks.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, our schedule shows we're going to do questions at the end, so would you mind
Yeah.
just hanging around for a little bit?
Yeah.
Great, all right. Now we're going to hear from Adam Longley, Associate Director of Tax Policy at the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy, who's going to talk about circuit breakers, homestead deductions, assessment caps, and other property tax provisions, as well as pilots. And I know he's done something, I read on his bio, he's created a fiscally sustainable standardized database reviewing the revenue and spending patterns of 150 US cities, which is a big
Wow.
job. I'm eager to see that as well. So ready to hear from him.
Send you guys the paper.
So interesting.
Yeah.
Is EITC,
Yes.
do you have to apply for it?
Yes.
Yes, you have to file an income tax return. It's not an application.
I
You
have
have to
certainly
file.
been discussed.
Yeah,
hopefully
There will be plenty of people on the
Yeah.
point.
Yeah.
I think
it needs to
Hopefully,
get
rid of the animations.
Like,
It
just-
doesn't happen automatically. About it. Could it?
Well, that's one of the
Okay,
questions.
all right.
We have- okay.
All right, well, first of all, thank you so much for the opportunity to come and speak to this group today. I'm really excited to have the opportunity to speak with you a little bit about some ideas for property tax relief for homeowners, as well as nonprofit payments in lieu of taxes. So just to start, I think this is probably a well-known fact, but I think it's just really important to underline at the beginning. The property tax is just really essential for the fiscal health of the district of Columbia, as it is for every local government around the country. And it raised almost $3 billion in revenue in 2021, more than the individual income tax, far more than the general sales tax, franchise tax, and all other taxes. So getting property tax policy right is really essential. And it makes sense that the high reliance on the property tax is not surprising when you think about the strengths that the property tax has as a local revenue source. First of all, it's a very stable revenue source over the business cycle. You can see here that during the Great Recession, property taxes fell less than half as much as sales or income taxes, which is particularly notable in that case. That was a recession, as everyone knows. It was really driven by these really large historic declines in property values, and still the property tax held up relatively well. So, it plays an important role in kind of stabilizing revenues when other revenue sources are going down. And then there are some other important strengths as well. It's a very efficient tax, the most efficient tax according to economic research. And one important strength for local governments is that it is an immobile tax base. So local governments just have a little bit more flexibility to adjust their tax rates to reflect local preferences without worrying that these small tax differentials are going to drive people away. Of course, like any tax, the property tax also has challenges. So addressing those challenges will kind of be the focus of today's talk. One is concerns about regressivity. Now, in fact, evidence shows that across most of the income distribution, the property tax is relatively proportional, thinking about the same share of income for households across the income distribution. But at the very bottom, there are definitely some concerns about regressivity. So that's one challenge that needs to be addressed. And then some other challenges. First, the property tax is not directly tied to households' ability to pay. It's based on property wealth. It's not based on current income. And so there are concerns about seniors on fixed incomes, people who lost their jobs, low income households in gentrifying areas, and so on. And then in addition, next slide, there are concerns about volatility. People are concerned that you could see a large increase in property values and that would in turn lead to a large spike in the property tax bill. Now, this particular challenge can be really mitigated with good administration, regular revaluations, adjusting the tax rates when necessary. But still, even with the best practices, you can see some large jumps for individual taxpayers. But the good news is that there are proven options out there to address each of these challenges and other challenges. But one point to emphasize is just it's really important to design programs carefully to target specific challenges and not just have these overly broad, unfocused programs that can have excessive revenue losses and other unintended consequences. I work at the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy. I've been working on property tax issues for over a decade, and recently got a major report on property tax relief for homeowners. So I'll be drawing from that research in today's presentation to focus a bit more on property tax relief in DC, why these programs are needed, how they work, and then some recommendations for improvement, again, drawing from this research. And then I'll touch briefly on nonprofit payments and move taxes as well. So to start, the most common approach to property tax relief in the US are homestead exemptions, called the homestead deduction in DC. It's a simple policy, it's just a flat dollar exemption, but it can have a significant impact on the property tax distribution and make it more progressive, and also offset any assessment inequities you may see with lower valued properties being overassessed. So it can be quite impactful. In DC, all owner-occupied homes are eligible for an $84,000 exemption. And you can see how that has that progressive impact. For a $420,000 home, it's a 20% savings. For $840,000 home, it's a 10% savings. For $1.7 million home, it's a 5% savings. So relatively larger tax savings going to lower value homes. And you can also see that in the effective tax rates paid at these different levels. The owner of the $1.7 million home is going to be paying an effective tax rate about 20% higher than the owner of the $420,000 home. In terms of recommendations, I would say maintain the current policy makes a lot of sense to me. DC already has one of the most generous homestead exemptions in the country. Increasing the deduction would make the property tax more progressive. It would provide significant property tax relief for lower income taxpayers, but it would also be quite expensive, and there are more cost-effective options to consider. So next slide. Another important property tax relief program in DC is the credit for seniors and disabled persons. This kind of reflects the common belief that seniors may be especially in need of property tax relief. And in DC, there's a 50% property tax credit for seniors and disabled homeowners with incomes under $150,000. In terms of recommendations, first, I just talked about how these flat dollar exemptions make the property tax more progressive. It's not the case for this percentage credit. The percentage credit, is leaving the property tax distribution unchanged and also directing the largest dollar savings to higher income taxpayers. So converting it to a flat credit or exemption would, arguably be more, it would undoubtedly be a more cost-effective way to provide property tax relief. And then also, maybe politically sensitive, but, I think it's worth thinking twice about tax preferences for seniors more generally. I just think the basic point, age is a very, very rough proxy for need. And, we have other easily available measures like income that can help us better target property tax relief. Next slide. And that's, I would say, where the property tax circuit breaker comes in. Circuit breakers are, they target tax relief to households paying the highest share of their income in property taxes relative to income. They're really meant to prevent households from being overburdened by property taxes. So, this is a great option for seniors on fixed incomes, workers who lost their jobs, and so on. And circuit breakers work by basically setting a threshold percentage of income, and then above that threshold, a certain, basically up to a certain percentage of income, property taxpayers are, responsible for paying that. But then above some threshold, the circuit breaker comes in to provide relief. In DC, the circuit breaker offsets property taxes above 3% of income for seniors up to $77,000 in income, and also offsets property taxes above 3% of income for younger households with incomes below $25,000. And the circuit breaker continues to offer property tax relief to younger households up to $56,000 in income, but with a reduced benefit. Kicks in to offset property taxes above 4 or 5%. Now, one important point about the circuit breaker, unlike other property tax relief programs, is that renters are eligible. And that, I think, is an important and perhaps overlooked strength of circuit breaker programs. Of course, renters don't pay property tax bills directly, but they do bear the cost of property taxes in the form of higher rent. And so the way states and DC deal with this is to just assume a certain percentage of rent is property tax. In DC, that's 20%, right in line with what most other states do. And then finally, the circuit breaker is capped at $1,225. So in terms of recommendations, first I would say most important would probably be to raise or eliminate the maximum credit. I'll kind of show in a moment how the credit can really result in inadequate tax relief for some of the most heavily burdened households. And then similarly, think about raising the income ceiling. Currently, households under 70 are cut off at $56,200. And so, you can have a moderate income household that's just really cut off completely. So that's just another policy to think about reforming. So next slide. So here I put together a table that shows the impact of DC's current circuit breaker. It also accounts for the homestead deduction to kind of illustrate how these two caps can result in inadequate relief for some particular households. So the cells in green, these are the only taxpayers that are kind of getting the full circuit breaker benefit as envisioned by the formula. Everyone to the right of this line is, you can click a couple times, is subject to the cap. And so, for example, you can have a taxpayer with a $20,000 income and a $500,000 home with an income of $20,000. The circuit breaker program says, well, okay, we're going to offset property taxes above 3% of income. But with that cap, that homeowner would actually be paying nearly 12% of their income in property taxes. So it is cutting off some needy taxpayers. And then, of course, in addition, you have this income ceiling, which is cutting off eligibility for households above $56,000 income. So, for example, you could have a taxpayer with $60,000 in income would be above that income ceiling, with the $700,000 home, they'd be paying nearly 9% of their income in property taxes. So, again, it's worth thinking about the impacts of that maximum credit and the income ceiling. Certainly, they're important for controlling program costs, but that also leads to one other recommendation, which would be to think about using what's called a co-payment requirement to control costs. So for example, in Michigan, the circuit breaker program is 40% co-payment. What that means is that above that threshold, taxpayers are still expected to pay 40% of the property tax. Above the threshold, the circuit breaker covers 60% above the threshold. And finally, consider converting the program to a property tax credit. It's currently an income tax credit. This could help ensure more timely property tax relief for households. Finally, another important property tax relief program in DC is the assessment increase cap. And the rationale here is to protect taxpayers against sharp increases in taxes. In DC, the program caps assessment increases at 10% per year for most households, and has a much lower 2% cap for seniors and disabled homeowners with incomes under $150,000. Might have this timeline a little bit off, but my understanding is that this 2% cap is new for tax year 2023. It had been 5% going back to 2019, and then before then, 10% like for younger households. In terms of recommendations, I think eliminating that low cap for seniors as soon as possible really is something worth seriously considering. There's so much research out there showing the unintended consequences of limits on growth and assessed values. You see large disparities in effective tax rates where you have owners of similar homes paying very different tax bills. And in practice, they tended to shift the tax burden towards poor neighborhoods and away from wealthier neighborhoods. So, those sorts of negative consequences grow over time. So since this is a new cut in the cap, it's kind of a good time to think about the consequences.
I'm sorry, could you go through that just once more? Just this page.
What, the whole thing, or just the DC policy?
The DC policy and the recommendations. Yeah, I'm not getting the cause and effect of what you're talking about.
Okay. Yeah, thank you. So, the DC policy for younger households, let's say your assessed value increased 12% last year. You would actually only, in terms of taxes, you would receive a credit to offset 2 percentage points there, so that your tax bill would not grow more than 10. I shouldn't say your tax bill. Your assessed value would not grow more than 10% per year. If you're over 65 and have an income under 150,000, it would be capped at 2% growth. So it just has a much bigger impact. If your assessed value increased 12%, now you're receiving a credit to offset 10 percentage points. So your assessed value can't go up more than 2% per year. And the reason that assessment limits lead to these inequities and effective tax rates is because people's properties are appreciating at very different rates. And so in practice, people whose properties are appreciating the fastest are receiving proportionally larger tax savings. People whose properties are growing slowly are, typically bearing more of the tax burden. Whether they're paying more in an absolute sense, it depends on how tax rates change. And in practice, most cities, you have higher appreciation in higher income neighborhoods. And so that's why we just observe the fact that in general, assessment limits shift the tax burden towards poor neighborhoods. So does that help?
Yeah.
So I just wanted to recap these 4 property tax relief options. Again, it's important that property tax relief is targeted to specific challenges and, that and seeking cost effectiveness is very important because there are many overly property tax relief programs that can be very expensive. So I'll go through this quickly. Again, the circuit breaker is the most cost-effective option for providing property tax relief. It is really meant to prevent taxpayers from being overburdened by property taxes. The flat dollar homestead exemption, like the homestead deduction in DC, is kind of moderately cost-effective. It will certainly improve progressivity and offset any assessment inequities, but it is also a pretty expensive way to provide property tax relief. The tax credit for senior and disabled persons in DC is not cost effective, in large part because it uses that percentage credit, which is sending a large share of the tax savings to higher value properties. And then finally, the assessment cap, the lower 2% cap for seniors anyhow, is not only cost ineffective, but also carries, or will carry, I should say, a lot of serious negative consequences as that 2% cap, those effects really compound over time. And so, go to the next slide. Oh yeah, I'll just underline, I guess, if the tax credit for seniors and disabled persons or the assessment cap were reduced or eliminated, that would not mean that seniors are all of a sudden unprotected against rising property taxes or excessive property tax burdens. The circuit breaker, particularly if kind of reformed, would address those problems more effectively than those other policies. So just want to take a few moments to talk about another topic that I've done a lot of research on, which is the nonprofit property tax exemption and payments in lieu of taxes. Nonprofits are exempt from paying property taxes in all 50 states. And that tax exemption reflects the fact that nonprofits do provide public benefits, in some cases including services that would otherwise be provided by the government, and thus are deserving of a tax subsidy. So that's the rationale for the exemption. But at the same time, it's also true that there are costs to provide services to nonprofits, and if they're tax exempt, that means homeowners and taxpayers need to pay more. In DC, the nonprofit property tax exemption costs the city a little over $400 million in foregone property tax revenues each year. It's about 14% total property tax collections. Most of that foregone revenue is from colleges and universities and this miscellaneous category, which includes like a really wide range of organizations. Next slide. So to address that, the impact of the property tax exemption, some cities seek payments in lieu of taxes from nonprofits, which are voluntary payments made by tax-exempt nonprofits as a substitute for property taxes. The most comprehensive survey on pilots found that over 200 localities have received pilots from nonprofits. And the most, I would say probably the best pilot program in the country is in Boston, where the city received over $35 million from 30 nonprofits in the most recent year. Slide. So I would say cities with a significant nonprofit presence should absolutely be thinking about pilots, but also need to weigh the pros and cons. There are many arguments for pilots. First of all, the nonprofits should pay for the cost of public services they consume, things like police, fire, street maintenance, and so on. And then also, there's a mismatch between the benefits and costs of hosting nonprofit institutions. The benefits of nonprofits, thinking of colleges and universities, many other nonprofits in the DC area, those are accruing broadly, throughout the nation, maybe even around the world. The costs in terms of foregone revenues is really borne entirely by city taxpayers. So that mismatch is one rationale for pilots. But at the same time, there are also compelling arguments against pilots. In some cases, the efforts to receive pilots have led to kind of contentious negotiations between cities and nonprofits. And the fact that they're voluntary means that the amount of payments can be kind of determined in an ad hoc way. You get these large disparities in payments from different institutions. And then also pilots have limited revenue potential. In Boston, they raise a little bit over 1% of property tax revenues. In most cities, it's less than 0.25% of general revenues. So pilots they're not a, silver bullet that's going to address any city's fiscal challenges, but they can be a kind of a productive middle ground. Nonprofits are still paying a lot less than what they would owe if they're taxable, but they are contributing something, and that can be meaningful revenue for the city, even if it is limited. And then finally, following some best practices can make pilots less contentious, more equitable, and more predictable. So the problems with pilots are not inevitable. They can be mitigated. So just to recap, again, the property tax has really important strengths as a revenue source for local government, but it has challenges like any other tax. Good news is that there are proven policy options to address those challenges, but relief programs really need to be designed carefully to address specific challenges and avoid these kind of overly broad programs that can cause excessive revenue losses and other unintended consequences. DC already has some of the best property tax relief programs in the nation, but there is space to improve them and make them even more effective. In particular, strengthening the city's circuit breaker program is probably the most effective option for making the property tax more equitable. Raising the cap on benefits and the income ceiling can make the circuit breaker more equitable, make sure that most heavily burdened households are getting adequate relief so that nobody is overburdened by property taxes. And then removing the 2% assessment cap for seniors at this time would really help kind of head off the inequities that I would predict you're going to be getting over the next 5-10 years. And then finally, considering nonprofit pilots, it's worth considering. So thank you for your attention, and be happy to take any questions.
Well, those were two fantastic presentations. I thought it was really great that you guys had recommendations to go along with it and gave us something to actually consider and act on. So I have a lot of questions, but I'm going to defer to my colleagues to start, of course.
I'll start with you. I can't remember exactly what year, but it was either 2009 or 10 after the Great Recession. The district passed a law that said that taxable assessments have to be at least 40% of market assessments. That was essentially because the cap worked in a weird way. When the market's improving and your values are improving, your cap is protecting you from tax increases. But if there's a downturn, maybe you lost the job, something bad happened, but you're still paying higher taxes because you're trying to catch up with the previous growth. So that 40% was, I'm just curious, what are your thoughts on maybe playing around with that number?
So I haven't given a lot of, I read about that cap and actually, contacted, someone in the office to make sure I understood how it worked. How many, do you have any sense of how many taxpayers are affected by it?
Actually, there's a fiscal impact statement on it, and the Office of Revenue Analysis worked on that. And it was interesting because the vertical disparities were so great depending on when you bought your house. Like if you buy it for $30,000 and then your cap is at 10%, and then 20 years later somebody buys the house next door for $300,000, you're literally being taxed at like $50,000 because of the starting point too low. I believe there's an answer to that. I just don't remember the number.
Honestly, I think it's an important policy, but I want to give it more thought. I didn't put a lot of thought into it because I just kind of assumed that it wasn't affecting that many taxpayers, and I could be wrong about that.
It did affect a lot of taxpayers, especially rapidly appreciating.
curious about commercial property.
Yep.
Yeah, I welcome the conversation about that. Actually, we're talking about relief, where people are paying less and less, but still getting services. I don't know how we're gonna manage the next few years unless people come back downtown and are not scared for their personal safety. So we've got buildings that are half empty. Naturally, these taxes are passed on to tenants who are taking less and less space because people don't want to come downtown and they don't need it. I'm curious what kind of tax policy we're going to try to architect to get people to fill these offices back. Because if we don't, this golden goose is cooked.
So, it's a really important issue, and I don't feel like anyone knows exactly what the next 5 years is going to hold. And so, my own thinking is that it's not primarily a tax policy issue. There's no doubt that, there's a lot of vacancies in commercial properties, but those businesses didn't leave because of high property taxes or high taxes in general. They left because of remote work, all these other factors. So, I'm a little, I'm not sure how much tax policy could change that dynamic. It's an open question. I don't really know what the appropriate response is.
Who could help us? I mean, I understand this is not your particular area.
Oh,
I'd love a recommendation, because I do think the totality of the costs, Mayor Williams for here, he would be talking about the totality of the regulatory burdens as well.
Yeah.
But the totality of the costs, which include taxes, are going to, if you've got a building, and just bear with me for a second, Raymond. If you've got a building, you paid $100 million for a couple of years ago, and when it was more or less fully occupied, and now it's at half, your rents aren't even covering your loan. And then you have operating maintenance costs on top of it, which include taxes. So the taxes are, these things do get passed on through increased costs to tenants. And, I do think people are making choices about, do I take this much space or this much space? So it may not be about them exiting the city entirely. It may be, look, I've got a cash crunch now, I need to save some money.
Since it's a little bit speculative, I don't want to spend a lot more time on it, but I guess I just wanted to clarify my point about it not being primarily a tax policy question. I think that the city may unfortunately deal with drops in revenues. So, but I don't think that if the property values are falling in line with market values, the assessed values are reflecting the drop in market values. You shouldn't see taxes, taxes should fall for businesses. And so you shouldn't,
It's an administration issue that we'll take up with the CFO, but, there are lag times.
yeah, there are, of course.
And, it's an expensive appeals process, and there is, it's not I'll leave it here, it's not, Mr. CFO, it's not an attack on the CFO's office, it's just institutionally, we're not going to send assessors out hacking their assessment rates. We're not going to do that. There's very real treasury reasons why, and the CFO institutionally needs to make sure we collect enough money to pay the bills. So I just want to inject the notion of when we're looking at where relief might be, that this is an important consideration, because this is the engine that funds the city.
Yeah, I think, David, that's coming up in subsequent meetings. I think we had a meeting dedicated to that. And also when we hear from people at AYOVA, at the chamber and others, I suspect we'll get a lot of input on just the solutions that you're talking
I
about.
think these were great recommendations from both parties. I was just asking if they had additional sources of information that could speak to that one issue. But it wasn't intending to have you survey the entire landscape. I was just asking if you had any thoughts or recommendations. I appreciate it.
I have lots of questions.
Go ahead.
And thank you so much for this. Bradley, I'm wondering what you might say about what we could do about the barriers to employment for
Sure.
Black residents. And sure, it's definitely a problem here in the district that might be sort of stymieing the effect of just black white income gap, and like the child tax credit help us with that.
So, you know, there's a couple things, and actually, you know, Adam's talk actually kind of dovetails in some ways I didn't anticipate. Federal city, you say anchor employer, and I say federal government. However, we do have this pretty robust constellation of higher ed institutions. And, you know, I want to be careful here, but, you know, almost each of these institutions is now situated in a really dynamic neighborhood. And many of the city's most successful workforce programs are operating through these universities. I mean, the universities really are part of a sort of a geographic transfer of income. With respect to many of the workers who are at Howard, Catholic, Georgetown, AU, conducting public safety, helping to maintain, clean, feed the faculty and students, right? So in that respect, you know, I actually think that the nonprofit educational institutions have to be handled carefully in that regard, and there is some leverage. It's an opportunity to leverage the fact that, hey, look, you have this tax break, but you also have a commitment to the city's residents and to help some of these workforce programs operate. And it's a workforce program. Again, you know, the model that I like is Work Advance. That's sort of a general model of kind of wraparound where it's training alongside with employment commitments at the back end of training. You know, you have institutions like Manpower Demonstration Research Corporation that have evaluated these sorts of programs. They're highly effective, but you got to have an employer on the back end to make that hire who's committed. And so I think the nonprofits are important there. So I think those sorts of programs matter. Yeah, I mean, we are still, as a economics and social science profession, assessing this 2021 child tax credit. But the preliminary evidence is that we achieved historic reductions in poverty. And the concerns, which I think are still being assessed, are whether and to what degree these large cash payments reduced employment. And, you know, right now, we just don't have any clear-cut evidence that this was the case. I think we're going to be continuing to look more at this. But what we do know is that, and I didn't put it up in the deck, but historically large drops in poverty. So, you know, given what we know now, you know, resources, reduced stress, consumption of enriching goods for kids, housing stability, go on and on, why additional income can be really important. And it does take away this need of having that job stability. Now, this is where I feel like I'm going to go outside of your question, but like the discussion's really good. You know, part of the downtown development story, and I don't speak for anybody but Bradley here. Part of the downtown development story, the DC education institutions are capped on growth at the neighborhood level. That's been my understanding. And so the way we grow is potentially to move out into other neighborhoods. And I'll wind up working downtown next to the Law Center in about 2 years. We'll move from main campus, the McCourt School, down next to the Law Center. There's a dorm being put up, I think, already now. And so I think that between folks who want to come to the Capitol, folks who want to learn in the Capitol, work in the Capitol, young people, for better or worse, have short memories. So I get on the Metro and have a negative experience, and I might not ride. I live right next to Friendship Heights. I might not ride for a month. And, you know, some of my students, you know, they'd be back like 2 days later. And so I think that there is an opportunity, broadly speaking, to think about the different constituents who want to grow and who would view it as an opportunity to be downtown. And land is highly immobile. Land is scarce. I will say as an aside that the students of my public finance class are probably going to have like midterm questions based on these presentations. So I don't think they're looking though. So.
I have
I'm fascinated by the
Yeah.
payment in lieu of taxes. I actually had friend of mine just was elected mayor of Providence, and they're now having their discussions with Brown on how much they give in this time period.
Yeah.
And it's fascinating, you know, and I don't think there's a great litmus test to tell whether or not a nonprofit is actually fulfilling its mission. And we may, you know, want to subsidize some missions versus others, and I think that's a fool's errand, because I don't know how we do it. But there might be a way to look at how we administer our CBE program in the city. In other words, in order to be eligible for CBE CBE benefits in the city, half of your employees have to live here, or so on and so on. There's certain core objective criteria that we can see a benefit in exchange for this nonprofit status. And so, for instance, and I just love your thoughts about this, whether it is an educational nonprofit or whether it's a religious nonprofit, that look, in order to maintain your tax exempt status, just as we require to get tax dollars from our CB programs, half of your employees have to be here, or your financial resources have to be housed in the District of Columbia. Those dollars are recycled in the community through small local banks and so on. Certain requirements that, again, are agnostic. I don't want to get into the picking who can and can't be. Let the IRS decide that. But couldn't we just make those demands?
So, DC is in a really unique situation because, in any other city, I would go to talk to about pilots. I'd say, well, you're subject to state law, and what types of nonprofits are tax exempt is set by state law. In DC, that's the city government. You know, there's the property tax exemption in DC does not follow. I could be wrong on this, depending on, you know, the DC Constitution, but like, I don't believe it. In other states, it does not need to be tied to how the IRS defines a charitable nonprofit. So you can set your own requirements to qualify for an exemption. And there are some states that have, you know, multi-pronged tests. So yeah, it's certainly something that is possible. It's another way
I
to.
think, however, what's different about DC is a lot of the properties that are exempted from taxation and are worth something are exempted by federal law.
Some, but not all.
Not all, that's right, yeah, but,
I understand.
yeah, okay.
But, you know, it's a good amount of time looking at this myself years ago when I had that responsibility. Not all are, but many are. And in order to, if we want to pay for these other things, some of which were mentioned earlier about increasing EITC and others, it just seems to me that it might be easier to expand this campus plan if the community around there knew it wasn't a non-tax paying entity, not employing district residents, not contributing to everything, munching up more scarce land. That's just my point, that if we could figure out a way to get something for it, it might make your campus plan expansions easier. It might actually put a real definable benefit to people in exchange for that benefit. That's all.
I mean, I think like in my instance, I'm actually envisioning a scenario where you actually have land that's by some definitions underutilized with respect to a residential population. And so, you know, I view the institutions in this instance as actually kind of making a bet on downtown DC in a way. And with young people, many of whom may put down roots. I mean, it's hard to perfectly forecast that. We do have an evidence base on the economic stimulus impacts of many nonprofits, including, you know, educational institutions. So I can dig that up. And it's everything from increased foot traffic that reduces crime to sort of research dollars that get pulled into the community and spent, stuff like that. So now that's oftentimes those sorts of studies are going to pool the results over multiple universities in multiple years. So it's hard for me to say, you know, the impact of AU, right? You know, but you know, this evidence base has sort of shown that many of these types of nonprofits can be economic stimulus in and of themselves. I mean, just, yeah, huge. I mean, the other piece is just that it's always tough. I mean, you all are considering the ability to reform, and it probably came through in my talk. Part of my talk was like, yes, continue. You know, like, this works. You're doing very good. This is a strong redistributive policy, the recommendation is don't break it. I think that likewise, the DC workforce is heavily driven by the nonprofit sector. So, like you tread lightly when you think about ways in which you might consider tinkering with that apparatus and that setup, and so I haven't thought hard about what you do, but I just say, boy, this is it's a unique and rich workforce,
Because we could tax revenue at its source, it wouldn't be a problem, but you know what I mean? So since we can't, let's use Georgetown as an example.
Yeah.
Georgetown brings immeasurable talent to the city, as to all our universities, and it pays for itself over and over again on the backs. Front side, though, it might be interesting to see, what are we getting? Is there a way to objectively try to figure that out, make that more conscious? To your workforce development issues, maybe they start looking at what their full spectrum of opportunities looks like and who's populating those jobs.
Yeah.
And again, just a thought.
And my only point is that they're doing it. Like it is happening at these universities. These universities are hiring folks who are disproportionately east of the river. They're coming in and it's observable. It's actually really impressive.
Good.
What I know less about is what's happening with our private sector counterparts. The operations are standing up. It's hard. It's almost like an apples and oranges. My friends at EY, they don't have a cafeteria. They go out to Sweet Green. You know what I mean? So there's just differences there. It's but I don't want to take it.
So let me ask you about the expansion of EITC
Yeah,
as a
yeah.
means of reducing income inequality. Is there a law of diminishing returns then in terms
It's
of
an interesting.
how much of the credit? I mean, could you exceed 100% of the federal credit? And then at some point, is it not going to have the impact that it does when it's less? Or
I mean, it's testable.
To me,
And this is definitely testable from the perspective of a social scientist. I mean, we've not seen that, right? So we don't have that test case. What I would say there is that, for better or worse, why folks love this earned income tax credit is that it is conditioned on work in the first place. So,
well, and then
It's
on that basis,
yeah.
now when the labor market is what it is, as
Yep.
opposed to what it might have been 10 years ago, how does that affect the efficacy of the program? Especially when wages are going up a little bit and the tax brackets are not indexed, like what does all that do? And then the last
Yeah.
question on
No,
the
that's-
FTC is,
yeah.
Is the credit from zero up, or if
Yeah.
you had a tax burden, would the credit, and the credit was greater than the tax burden, would it eliminate the tax burden plus a reduction in the credit, or would the credit all be above zero?
Yeah, so you can have a situation, actually, seen this in the data, right, where, you're offsetting, you have EITC, and you have 4 states, for example, in my deck, that have these non-refundable supplements to the EITC. And in fact, the credit started out initially as a way to just offset tax burden for workers with low wages. And, policymakers looked up and said, look, we want to offset the tax burden here, right? So we'll have this credit, and it'll just offset the tax burden. And it grew throughout the 80s and 90s to be this larger refund. So absolutely, some of that credit is simply offsetting maybe a little bit of taxes owed, and then the remainder is in a refund. I mean, I think the question you pose about kind of the impacts on workers and maybe their behavior on making this credit increasingly generous, it's super interesting, right? I mean, I think the micro theory says that you're incentivizing more work. Now, some people might decide that with all this extra money, they pull back. We don't see in the labor economics literature, at least my reading of it, much evidence that people are particularly price sensitive in terms of work behavior in that way, pulling back. Some of it's that I don't control my hours typically as a worker. Like I come to work, you tell me I'm working 30 hours. You tell me I'm working 40 hours. I mean, that's its own interesting policy problem in and of its own right. That the worker, if you don't want to work those hours, you don't have a job, right? So I think that I come at this being a little less concerned about workers responding kind of by pulling back from work. I think there's obviously relevant questions about, your revenue sources, things like this. I think I'm actually really interested in, and I just haven't done as much of this work, thinking about ways in which these sorts of resources can be delivered to subsets of city residents who might even be at higher risk of various, negatives, albeit contact with the criminal justice system, for example. So, how can we make work pay for some of these folks who we want to really pull back in a positive way?
And then, so the other thing is about, you mentioned about the percentage of people who are taking advantage of it. So I was gonna ask the same question about the renter's abatement for the property tax caps. Can it be seamless? In other words, so people have to file, they file their 1040, they file taxes, there's yet another form on top. Is there a way through tax administration to make that credit, I'm gonna use the word automatic, or because I'm sure there are people that don't even know they can benefit from it, or they didn't get it on TurboTax, or it's not there, or how many people don't take advantage of it that could, and is there a way to solve for that?
Now, it's interesting. I have a piece of the answer, but between the CFO and Erica and Yeshim, I know there's a lot of folks here who have something to say on this. Nationwide, you've probably got something on the order of 80% take up of the earned income credit in any given year. And say, for example, in the case of the 2021 child tax credit, there were Federal Reserve researchers who showed in another region, albeit, that the most economically disadvantaged census tracts had the lowest take up of the CTC, this really generous credit that would have helped those very neighborhoods the most. So in essence, problem one is even getting them to the point of service to load up TurboTax or go to the VITA site to work through those forms. My understanding is that there are multiple forms. You've got your federal stuff, and then you're going to work through your DC forms. But that's where I'll stop, and I'll let others.
You have to file an income tax return to be able to get either the child tax credit or the earned income tax credit, right? That's the
But there's another
Yes.
form on top of that,
DC,
correct?
Right, but that's like the lesser problem. The bigger problem, as I understand it, the take-up rate is low because people do not file in the first place. As long as you file, everything flows from that.
I think with the EITC though, a lot of the low take-up, some of the research shows a lot of the low take-up is single filers who get a much smaller credit. So there's not less incentive for them to go file their taxes at a max $500.
Right.
Okay.
The rest of them. So, I mean, it might be interesting to see the difference in take-up singles.
Okay. Yeah.
through the rest of the plan. I do think, there's states that Washington State doesn't have an income tax and has an earned income tax credit now. And they are using IRS data to determine and check who's eligible. They're still going to require people to fill out those, but I think that says to me that we have enough of the data from coordinate with the IRS to know generally who is eligible.
Do they,
That's
are they,
based on who's filing federal.
not the filing, not the W-2? I have a question, can
I have
I
some
could-
property tax questions too.
Go ahead, I know you're.
I mean, I'm on the question of the homestead deduction, I'm curious if like means testing that would improve its effect, or is it just like, there's no need to even.
So, I think if the goal is to have more cost-effective property tax relief, strengthen the circuit breaker is a better way to go than to the homestead deduction. Yeah, we're getting a little bit on participation rates, which I didn't even really talk about, but is a major problem with circuit breakers. And so with homestead exemptions, making it means tested is probably the biggest thing that can drop your participation rate, because all of a sudden you need to apply annually as opposed to one time. So, yeah, I think means testing the homestead deduction seems to be, I would think would be a much less promising route to trying to address some goals of making the property tax more equitable than changing the circuit breaker.
I was supposed to say.
Yeah.
Quick is, do you think that shifting from an income tax credit to a property tax credit will shift the take-up? Because I think one of the reasons we're doing things through the income tax code is that so many more people have to file just do to ensure.
Yeah, yeah, it is a really important issue. So I think there are some trade-offs that you're kind of alluding to between an income tax credit and a property tax credit for a circuit breaker. Participation rates for circuit breakers oftentimes are, 80% is really amazing. You see like 40%. And so I do worry that switching to a property tax credit could reduce your participation rate potentially significantly. But there is that issue of timeliness, where, you're paying your property tax, I don't know the exact timeline, but, April 2021 and getting your income tax credit a year later. So it's just, that is a timing problem. And also is a problem in terms of how people perceive themselves as whether they're actually receiving property tax relief.
Isn't there an added benefit of using the income tax system to ensure that there's no like home? We are actually working with DC residents. If you switch to property taxes, we already have this problem about homestead deduction and all that stuff.
You think through the income tax we're targeting residents?
Yeah.
With
Can I ask one question? Okay, I don't even know how to ask this question, Bradley, this is for you. I was fascinated by the sort of like the limitations or an income tax credit is folks' ability to find jobs or participate in the labor market. My first question is, as you did this research, what was your data source?
Oh, yeah, so we're using a Census Bureau data, the current population survey. This is kind of the workhorse poverty and income data set in the United States, going back to 1980. Yeah. So it's demographic information and income.
And I know that the guys are
Yeah.
sampling the CPS is like 3 people, so I remember it's hard to always get it for DC. But
Yeah.
do you think the results would, in your mind, would be more aggravated or less aggravated in the case of District of Columbia, both within sort of the overall income distribution and the black-white gap?
Yeah, I mean, Washington DC has high income and high income inequality. It has elevated poverty relative to the national average, probably something like 6 or 7 percentage points higher in DC. My prior, and even in some of the work I've done internally, is that the credit is a redistribution east of the Anacostia River disproportionately. And that my prior would be that you would have, similar levels of inequality reduction or more. Again, that's something that we could probably look at using the American Community Survey potentially. You can't do the demographics thing on the tax file. I don't know race ethnicity per se, right? So you can't quite do the same thing. But it is an interesting question. I mean, I worked with some economists at the Census Bureau who then work with folks at the IRS. So there probably are ways to get at this question focused on the District of Columbia. So I think it's a great question.
In my mind, not to give you any idea,
Yeah.
get you in trouble, it would be fascinating to connect the longitudinal data from public schools with the unemployment insurance administrative data or something of that sort.
Yeah.
To figure out sort of like these early career outcomes and who participates, what happens to public school graduates.
Oh, yeah.
Because we don't really know anything. All we know is most of them don't go to college. And then if they don't go to college, they're mostly making $24,000 as a cashier, which is what APS tells us.
Well, it's interesting. Your questions, Yeshim, actually reminded me of another point that probably needed to come through, which is that there's been some disagreement on whether and in what ways to think about the EITC potentially being delivered within year. And, I do think it's something that folks could continue to think about. Like, I kind of made an offhand appeal to the idea that many families appreciate the lump sum payment, But many of our households that have low income also have very volatile incomes. They're in sectors where the hours are unstable. And so it can be useful to have maybe a quarterly payment, for example. So I think that, I'm sure this has come up. I think there's complexity here, right? But it's something to kind of keep in mind, right? Like, yeah. There's been low take up of that nationally, I think, at times.
I have a question about
we're
the-
instituting a month.
Okay, okay. It's exciting.
Yeah.
I'd like to hear all about
It's
that.
about to happen.
Yeah.
Question for Adam about your various tax relief proposals again in the end. Do you know the relative fiscal impact of those various things that you had on the last slide, particularly if you eliminated the 2% cap? Seems like, is one of them particularly a bigger hit to the treasury than? any other thing that-
Well, I have not done that analysis. That would be, I spent some time with the tax expenditure report in preparation for this. So, I think there probably could be, an analysis could absolutely be done. I mean, removing the assessment cap would actually bring in revenue. So, raising the, some of those changes to the circuit breaker could be very expensive.
But I think it'd be.
But they're all parameters that can be tweaked, you can go up $200 or,
So talk to us a bit about pilots. So I'm really ignorant about how this works. You underscored voluntary in your presentation.
yeah.
So I'm sitting down with University X.
Yep.
Will you please volunteer to pay all this money to me? So how does that conversation unfold in Boston or elsewhere? Like what?
Yeah, slowly. I think that, I would say that I've read about and spoken to people with pilots in dozens of different cities. And it does seem like in general, the kind of collaborative, respectful approach of bringing the nonprofits along, kind of making the case that this is why the city needs you to step up to make these contributions. This is what the money is going to be used for. And, hearing them out, hearing their concerns, it can eventually lead nonprofits to voluntarily make these payments. These institutions like universities they're not going anywhere. They're really invested in the city, which is great from an economic development perspective. It also does mean that they do have a stake in the fiscal health of the city. And, we early on tonight heard about how Providence is negotiating some pilots.
Well, I mean, to David's point about
Yeah.
if you're going to do this, pick your fights wisely. Have cities kind of just put a threshold of, we're only going to talk to people who occupy this much land or have this many employees or have this size budget. I mean, do people kind of just have a threshold under which it's not worth the fight?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
So I would say the program that I'm most familiar with, and is definitely kind of the most thought out and kind of consistent, has the most consistent treatment of nonprofits, is in Boston. And they ask nonprofits to contribute 25% of what they would owe if they were taxable. But they have a $15 million exemption. So I think there was 47 nonprofits in the city with property valued at more than $15 million. And so, this is not a question about, your small social service provider or churches, that sort of thing. It is larger institutions.
So much, such a rich presentation. Any other?
I have a request from the staff. Is it possible to get these in a way that my old eyes can see?
Well, it says here on my script that we're supposed to discuss among ourselves the impact of all that we learned tonight for our future recommendations and means for further exploration. I think it's everything we heard tonight. But is there anything jump out that we need to kind of put a marker for to come back to, questions raised or things that we definitely know we want to hear again or talk about again, besides everything, I guess? It seems to me like, raising the EITC made a very compelling case for it. So that's something that we're gonna want to put on perhaps the short list of things to. I think we should review all of your recommendations in this slide as well and get the fiscal impacts of all of them, positive and negative. And again, I guess that would be from.
I do want to explore a little bit more about sort of like if we were to raise that 40%, that your taxable assessment has to be at least 40%. Like what if we change to 50 or 60? What's the geographic impact? What's the fiscal impact? I'd be interested in that.
Just two. Yeah. One is going to be heresy. It's the notion of how do we extend something equivalent to an EITC to immigrant families. You know, we made a commitment in this very floor 21 years ago to cover immigrant communities with our lookalike Medicaid program. And, you know, if we could just, and I don't mean to make our CFO's life more challenging, so then I'm sorry about this, but I do think it would be interesting to pilot some type of equivalent. I say that without having to be burdened with the details of how it's done. Our immigrant community for this very purpose. And I think you could tether it to, you know, DC identifications, which we have. We also have, there's a whole process for being eligible for the alliance. Something to consider.
We did expand in 2022, the EITC extended it to folks who could file ITIN, individual temporary. So
That may not, and I appreciate that, that may not be folks who are somewhat newly arrived, you know, that.
yeah, I mean, we would have to do some work to help people get ITINs and issue them to, but we do have a policy.
Maybe, you know, the less interaction with the federal government, obviously the better. It's just running. The second thing I think is a discussion of, you know, we about be smarter about the way in which we incentivize the reductions in personal property tax. You know, the politically popular thing to do is to throw another bone to, you know, our senior population without any evidence about how they're doing financially. I would rather us consider, you know, what kind of incentives can actually promote affordable housing on the tax front. That seems to be a sensible use of that investment. You know, years ago, this dates me, we used to have a bifurcated tax rate for rental property versus non-rental property, be much higher. And not unsurprisingly, it burdened the people's willingness to engage in rental property. So looking at how we do that, doesn't require picking winners, which we often do in the Treasury by here's your favorite developer getting this particular sum for this particular purpose, but democratizing it a bit and letting everyone participate to the extent that they're willing to put a certain set aside for people of a certain income, of a certain percentage, and to see if it works. I don't know, maybe it doesn't. I'd be interested in Gregory and exploring.
So I have a feeling we're going to invite you back.
This was very together.
Yeah. Perhaps when we've got some preliminary thoughts, we'd love to hear your discussion about it. Any commissioners, anything else to?
Thank you so much.
It was awesome.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Are
we adjourned?
Oh, no, sorry, before I say that, do we, according to my notes, we are?
Okay.
Yes, unless you got some.
No, no, no. Say that.